March 2016. Sergei Kozlov was walking along a familiar path, listening to the spring sounds of the awakening forest. In 30 years of hunting, he had studied every tree in this thicket near Tula. But today something was wrong. The old oak tree under which he had often sheltered from the rain looked strange. There was a gaping hole in its mighty trunk. Last autumn's hurricane had split the wood, exposing a secret cavity almost a meter deep. Kozlov moved closer. Curiosity overcame caution. He peered inside and froze. At the bottom of the hollow lay a rusty Kalashnikov assault rifle. Next to the weapon were scraps of decayed camouflage fabric. Sergei recognized the Russian military uniform. His heart began to beat faster. He had served in the army and knew that weapons were not simply left behind. Before we begin the story, please write which city you are from. We are very interested to know where you are watching our video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your rating. The hunter took out his phone and called the police. While he waited, he examined his find. The metal was rusted, but the serial number was still legible. There were patches and dark spots on the pieces of fabric. But the most terrifying discovery was found deep inside the hollow. Sergei felt a crumpled piece of paper. The handwriting was uneven and hasty, but most of the words had been blurred by time and moisture. Kozlov realized that he was holding the last message of dead people. But who were they? And what had happened in this forest? An hour later, the investigation team arrived. Senior Lieutenant Markov carefully examined the finds. He immediately ran the serial number of the assault rifle through the database. The result made him frown. The weapon is registered to Military Unit 3485, he told his colleagues. About 15 kilometers from here. Disbanded in 2001. Markov remembered an old case. In February 1996, 3 soldiers disappeared from this unit. The search yielded nothing. And now the forest was revealing its secret piece by piece. The experts removed all the evidence. DNA analysis revealed the terrible truth. Traces of blood from 2 different people were found on the scraps of uniform. Something terrible had happened. Handwriting analysis identified the author of the note. Sergeant Igor Petrov had written these lines. His handwriting matched samples from his personal file. But what was he trying to tell his descendants? Markov studied the list of soldiers from the winter of 1996. Private Alexei Morozov, 19 years old, conscript from Ryazan. Corporal Dmitry Volkov, 20 years old, a contract soldier. Sergeant Igor Petrov, 22 years old, guard commander. All 3 disappeared on the night of February 15, 16. The official version spoke of desertion or an accident. But the discovery in the hollow changed everything. The investigator dug up the archives of that fateful night. The blizzard began at 11:30 p.m. and continued until morning. The temperature dropped to minus 26 degrees Celsius. Visibility was 0. The soldiers were last seen at 12:00 a.m. when they took up their guard duty. At 6 in the morning, they were supposed to be relieved by the next shift. But the barracks were empty. The officer on duty at the time said he heard shots around midnight. He decided it was training exercises. Residents of the nearest village reported strange lights in the forest. The search operation lasted 2 weeks. They combed the entire area using dogs and a helicopter. They found neither bodies nor traces. The case was closed as hopeless. Now the forest itself has revealed part of the mystery. The automatic rifle belonged to one of the missing soldiers. But where are the rest of the weapons? Where are the bodies? And most importantly, what happened that night? Markov organized a new search within a 5-kilometer radius of the oak tree. They used metal detectors, ground-penetrating radar, and dogs. They searched for graves, hiding places, any traces of the tragedy. On the third day of the search, they found another clue. Half a kilometer from the oak tree, they discovered a rusty helmet with bullet holes. Inside were hair and traces of blood. The examination showed that the helmet belonged to Private Morozov. The DNA matched completely. This meant that the young soldier had died a violent death. But who killed him? Markov studied the records of all three soldiers. Petrov was an exemplary sergeant who planned to become a career officer. Morozov was known for his honesty and helped his family financially. There was less information about Volkov. He was a contract soldier from a dysfunctional family. Before joining the army, he had problems with the law. He served in the unit without any violations, but his comrades noted his secretiveness. In the winter of 1995, Volkov's behavior changed. He became nervous and withdrawn. He often left town without permission. He asked his fellow soldiers for money. One of his fellow soldiers recalled a strange detail. In December, some people came to see Volkov at the unit. Two men in leather jackets talked to him at the gate. After that visit, Volkov became like a madman. He couldn't settle down and was constantly on the phone. He told his comrades that he was in serious trouble. Markov realized that he needed to find a connection between the soldier's disappearance and Volkov's problems. Perhaps the young man had dragged his comrades into some kind of dangerous situation. The investigator contacted the Tula Regional Internal Affairs Directorate. He asked them to look into the criminal gangs of 1995. Perhaps there would be some information about the mysterious visitors. The answer came a week later. There were several criminal gangs operating in Tula at the time. They controlled gambling establishments, racketeering, and drug trafficking. The Voronin gang was particularly active. They protected gambling clubs throughout the city. They had connections in the police and the administration. They dealt harshly with debtors. Markov sensed that this was an important lead. Perhaps Volkov had gotten into debt with criminal organizations. And when he couldn't pay, tragedy struck. But how was this connected to the disappearance of the three soldiers? Had the killers gotten into the military unit? Or had something even more terrible happened? The investigator decided to gather all the documents on the military unit. He wanted to study the daily routine, the security system, and the layout of the facilities. He wanted to understand how events could have unfolded. An interesting circumstance came to light. A military ammunition depot was located a mile away from the unit. Tons of explosives, ammunition, and grenades were stored there. The depot was guarded around the clock. But that night, only one sentry was on duty. It was strange that the command did not increase security in such a blizzard. Markov requested documents on the depot. It turned out that on the morning of February 16th, signs of a break-in had been found there. The locks had been broken, but nothing was missing. A theory began to take shape. Someone had planned to rob the military warehouse. But something had gone wrong. Perhaps there had been a conflict between the accomplices. Or maybe one of the soldiers had revealed the criminal plan, tried to prevent the theft of military property. Then he could have been killed as a witness. But who was behind the robbery? And why did all three soldiers disappear? Too many questions, too few answers. Markov summoned the former colleagues of the missing soldiers for questioning. Perhaps they would remember important details. They could tell him about the mood in the unit, any conflicts or strange behavior. The first to arrive was Senior Sergeant Kuznetsov, a strong man of about 50 with a military bearing. He remembered all three soldiers well. Petrov was a golden boy. Kuznetsov said. Principled, honest. He dreamed of becoming an officer and valued his reputation. Morozov was also a good soldier. What can you say about Volkov? Markov asked. The sergeant paused, searching for words. It was clear that his memories of Volkov evoked mixed feelings. Dmitri was a complicated guy. Capable, physically strong, but very secretive. He didn't get close to his comrades. Kuznetsov remembered how Volkov had changed dramatically in the winter of 1995. He became nervous and irritable. He constantly asked to borrow money under various pretexts. He said his parents were sick and needed money for treatment. I believed him and gave him 5,000 rubles. At that time, that was half an officer's salary. Volkov promised to repay the debt in a month. But in February, he disappeared along with his comrades. He never returned the money. Kuznetsov still remembered this. The next witness was Private Mikhailov. He was friends with the missing soldiers and often spent his free time with them in the city. The three of us went on leave, Mikhailov said. Petrov, Morozov, and me. Volkov didn't talk to us. He kept to himself. But in January 1996, Volkov unexpectedly suggested that they join him. He took them to a gambling club on Lenin Street. He said that it was easy to make money there. I immediately realized it was a dangerous game, Mikhailov recalled. I warned the guys that slot machines were a trap, but they didn't listen. Petrov and Morozov went to the club with Volkov several times. At first, they even won small amounts. They were happy and planned to make a big score. But in February, the mood of all three changed dramatically. They became gloomy and nervous. They argued among themselves, but remained silent in front of others. I last saw them the day before they disappeared, Mikhailov said. Petrov looked very worried. He said he was in serious trouble. Morozov asked him to say hello to his parents if anything happened to him. At the time, Mikhailov thought it was a joke. Now he understood that the soldier had a premonition of trouble. Markov recorded all the statements. The picture was beginning to become clearer. Volkov had drawn his comrades into gambling. They had run up debts to criminal organizations. When it came time to pay up and there was no money, the creditors demanded another form of payment. Perhaps they wanted military equipment from the ammunition depot. But one of the soldiers opposed the criminal plan. Perhaps Petrov, as the guard commander, refused to participate in the theft. Then he could have been killed. Or maybe something even more terrible happened. A conflict between the soldiers themselves? Betrayal by one of their comrades? Markov understood that new evidence was needed. The search in the forest continued, but nothing else was found. The earth kept its secrets tightly. The investigator decided to study the archives of the Udacha gambling club. Perhaps there were documents there about the soldiers' debts, or information about the owners of the establishment. The club had long since closed, and the owner had died under mysterious circumstances. But the police archives contained interesting materials about this establishment. It turned out that Udacha was a front for a more serious business. The club was used to launder money, plan crimes, and recruit new members to the gang. A certain Viktor Semenov, nicknamed Golden, was particularly active there. He was a tall man with a distinctive scar on his face and gold teeth. Semenov was involved in debt collection. He personally visited debtors and threatened them with violence. Many preferred to pay up by any means necessary. In 1998, Semenov was arrested for murder. He was sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security prison. But by that time, he had already caused a lot of trouble. Markov realized that this was the same man who had come to Volkov in December. Semenov demanded repayment of the debt and threatened to kill the soldier. Cornered, Volkov agreed to any terms the creditors demanded, even robbing a military warehouse. But something went wrong. Perhaps Petrov and Morozov refused to participate in the crime. Then Volkov found himself caught between two fires, his comrades and the gangsters. Or maybe the soldiers agreed to the adventure, but at the last moment someone changed their mind. Or did a dispute arise between them over the division of the loot? There were too many versions and too few facts. Markov understood that without new clues, the case could reach a dead end. He needed to find witnesses, documents, any clues. But time was working against the investigation. 20 years had passed since the crime. Many witnesses had died, documents had been lost, and clues had been erased. However, the investigator did not give up. He believed that sooner or later the truth would come out. He just needed to find the key to this long-standing mystery. And then the families of the dead soldiers would finally learn what happened to their sons on that terrible February night in 1996. Who killed Petrov and Morozov? Who hid the evidence in the hollow of an oak tree? Who knows the truth about the missing guard? September 2016. The investigation into the missing soldiers has reached a dead end. Markov has gone over all the versions, questioned dozens of witnesses, and studied hundreds of documents. But the main question remained unanswered. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Forensic expert Anna Volkova was studying a note from the hollow under a powerful microscope. Most of the words had been erased by time, but modern technology made it possible to restore the invisible. "There's something here," she said to Markov. "Look, other letters are showing through the main text. Someone wrote on this paper before. Special treatment with chemical reagents revealed the hidden text. It was part of a letter home written by Sergeant Petrov a week before his disappearance. Mom, things are rough at the unit. One of the guys got mixed up with some bad people. I'm afraid he'll get us all in trouble. If anything happens, know that I tried to do the right thing." Markov felt that this was the key to solving the case. Petrov knew that trouble was coming. He had a premonition that one of his comrades was planning a crime. But who exactly? The investigator returned to studying the soldiers' personal files. Morozov was a crystal-clear, honest guy. All his references spoke of his integrity. That meant the problem was with Volkov. But where was Dmitry Volkov now? 20 years had passed since his disappearance. He could have died, gone abroad, changed his identity. Finding him seemed like an impossible task. Markov turned to his colleagues in the Criminal Investigation Department. He asked them to check all the databases for Volkov: passport offices, hospitals, places of work, prisons. The result was strange. Dmitry Volkov seemed to have vanished into thin air after February 1996. No official documents, records, or mentions. "Either he's dead or living under a different name," said the head of the investigation. "The second option is more likely. It wasn't hard to get fake documents in the 90s. The search was expanded to neighboring regions. They checked the archives of the registry offices, military registration offices, and medical institutions. They were looking for a man who appeared in documents after February 1996. The work was painstaking, like looking for a needle in a haystack. Hundreds of thousands of records, dozens of similar names and dates of birth. But there were no results. Then Markov decided to use modern technology. Facial recognition software could find Volkov from old photographs, if he had been caught on surveillance cameras or appeared in documents. A photo of the 20-year-old Volkov was uploaded to the system. The computer began comparing his facial features with millions of images in the databases of various agencies. The search took several days. The system methodically sifted through photos from passports, driver's licenses, and medical records. And then it suddenly found a match. The man in the photo from the Almaty Police Department looked very similar to the young Volkov. The age was right, and the facial features matched. But his name was Dmitry Kozlov. Markov requested detailed information. Dmitry Kozlov, 40 years old, worked on a construction site in Almaty. He had been officially registered there since 1997. Before that, he had no documents. It's him, the investigator realized. Volkov fled to Kazakhstan and lived under a false name for 20 years. But they needed solid proof. Markov sent a request for fingerprint analysis. If the prints matched, Volkov would be exposed. The response from Almaty came a week later. The prints matched perfectly. Dmitry Kozlov and Dmitry Volkov were the same person. The killer of two comrades had been found. Kazakh colleagues received an arrest warrant. Volkov was detained right at his workplace. He did not resist arrest, only quietly said, "I knew this day would come." The extradition took 2 months. In the fall, Volkov was brought to Tula. Markov finally saw the man he had been looking for over a year. Dmitry looked older than his 40 years. He had gray hair, deep wrinkles, and tired eyes. 20 years on the run had changed him beyond recognition. "Do you want to tell us what happened that night?" Markov asked during the first interrogation. Volkov was silent for a long time. It was clear that he was struggling internally. He had kept a secret for 20 years, and now he had to reveal it. "I'm ready to tell the truth," he finally said. "I'm tired of carrying this burden. I want the parents of those kids to know what happened to them." But Markov was in no hurry to turn on the tape recorder. First, he had to make sure the suspect was sincere. He had to check his willingness to cooperate fully. "Tell me about yourself," the investigator asked. "How have you lived these past 20 years?" Volkov sighed heavily, his eyes filled with the pain of old memories. He began slowly, as if each word came with difficulty. "After that night, I ran away from the army. I made it to Moscow, where my brother helped me change my documents. 6 months later, I left for Kazakhstan. In Almaty, Volkov found work on a construction site. He worked as a bricklayer, crane operator, and handyman. The hard physical labor helped drown out the voice of his conscience. "I didn't live during those years. I existed," he admitted. "I didn't start a family or make plans. I understood that I had no right to happiness." Every night, Volkov was tormented by nightmares. He saw the faces of Petrov and Morozov and heard their voices. He tried to kill himself several times, but he didn't have the courage. "When I was arrested, I was even glad. Finally, this torture would end. I would be able to tell the truth and ask for forgiveness." Markov wrote down every word, but he had not yet touched on the main question. What exactly happened on that February night? How did the soldiers die? "Are you ready to talk about the night of February 15, 16? Asked the investigator. Volkov covered his face with his hands. He was silent for several minutes, gathering his strength. Then he raised his head and began to speak. "The three of us were on guard duty, Petrov, Morozov, and me. It was a terrible night, a blizzard, freezing cold. Visibility was 0. In the barracks, they warmed themselves by the stove and played cards. Around midnight, Volkov decided to tell his comrades about his problems, about his debts, threats, and hopeless situation. I explained to the guys that I needed money, a lot of money. I suggested we earn some at the military warehouse, sell some of the ammunition." His comrade's reaction was predictable. Petrov categorically refused to participate in the theft of military property. Morozov supported him. Igor said that I would disgrace the honor of the unit, that you can't betray your oath for money. He threatened to report me to the command. An argument ensued, which quickly escalated into a quarrel. Petrov demanded that Volkov abandon his criminal plan. He threatened arrest and a court-martial. I realized they were going to turn me in. In the morning, they would report to the commander, and I would be arrested. And then the debt collectors would definitely kill me. There was no way out. Volkov took his automatic rifle and pointed it at his comrades. He demanded silence and promised not to touch anyone. But Petrov tried to disarm him. A fight broke out. The automatic rifle fired. Igor fell. Then there were several more shots. Alexei was also wounded. Markov listened carefully to the confession. The story sounded plausible, but it needed to be verified. The bodies of the dead had to be found, and the crime scene had to be examined. "Where did you hide the bodies?" asked the investigator. Volkov pointed in the direction. A mile away from the former military unit was a marshy area. In winter it was covered with ice, but in spring it became impassable. I broke through the ice and lowered them in. I thought the bodies would sink to the bottom in the spring. No one would find them. The next day, they went to the site. Volkov showed the exact location of the makeshift grave. Divers began searching the swamp. The search took a whole day. Visibility in the murky water was zero, and they had to work by touch. But by evening, their efforts were rewarded. Human remains were found at the bottom. 2 skeletons of young men with characteristic gunshot wounds. The examination confirmed that they were Petrov and Morozov. The victims were between 18 and 25 years old, said the forensic expert. Death was caused by gunshot wounds to the head and chest. The discovery completely confirmed Volkov's story. He had indeed killed his comrades and hidden their bodies in the swamp. The evidence was clear. Markov felt relieved. A 20-year-old mystery had been solved, and the criminal had been exposed. The families of the victims would finally learn the truth about their son's fate. But the main question remained. What made the young soldier kill his comrades? What debts were so critical that the only way out was double murder? Volkov spoke of debt collectors, threats, and a hopeless situation. But what exactly happened in the winter of 1995? What did he get himself into? "Will you tell us about your debts?" Markov asked. Volkov nodded. He was ready to be completely honest. He understood that only the truth would help him atone for his guilt towards his fallen comrades. "It all started with a gambling club," he began. "I thought it was easy money. Soldiers' pay was low, and I wanted more. His first visits to Udacha were profitable. Volkov won, bought cigarettes for his comrades, and felt successful. But gradually, his luck ran out. By December, I owed 30,000 rubles. That was a huge amount of money back then, more than an officer's annual salary. The club owners sent debt collectors. Viktor Semenov, with his gold teeth, clearly explained the consequences of non-payment. By the end of February, it was either money or the grave. He wasn't joking. I knew these people would kill for less. I had to find a way out fast. A military ammunition depot was the only way to save himself. Explosives and ammunition were highly valued on the black market. One raid could solve all his problems. But it was impossible to get into the depot alone. I needed accomplices. I decided to recruit Petrov and Morozov. Volkov counted on the support of his friends. He thought they would understand his desperate situation. But he misjudged them. They turned out to be more principled than I thought. The honor of their uniform was more important to them than money or even their lives. When it became clear that his comrades would not support his criminal plan, Volkov realized he was trapped. Petrov and Morozov knew about his intentions and could report him. If they had reported me to the command, I would have been arrested. And the debt collectors would not have bothered to find out why. They would have killed me anyway. There was only one way out: eliminate the witnesses. It was a terrible choice between his own life and the lives of his comrades. Volkov chose himself. "I didn't want to kill them," he repeated. "I just wanted to scare them, to make them keep quiet." But it all went wrong. Markov listened to the confession with a stony face. The story was logical, but no less horrific for that. A gaming addiction had led a soldier to commit double murder. Now it was time to notify the families of the deceased, to tell the mothers the truth about their sons' deaths, to explain that their children had died defending military honor. Valentina Ivanovna Morozova arrived in Tula immediately after the investigators' call. The gray-haired woman in a black headscarf listened to the story of her son's last moments. "Alexei remained honest to the end," Markov said. "He refused to participate in the theft. He preferred death to betrayal." Tears streamed down the old woman's face. She had waited 20 years for this meeting. She wanted to know the truth, no matter how terrible it was. "Thank you for finding him," she whispered. "Now I can bury my son in a proper manner." Igor Petrov's parents did not live to see this day. But his younger sister, Elena, also came for the truth. She learned that her brother had died like a true officer. "Igor was always a man of principle," she said. "Even as a child, he couldn't stand injustice. I'm glad he didn't change." The soldier's remains were solemnly reburied in a military cemetery. The ceremony was attended by veterans, military personnel, and relatives. Petrov and Morozov finally received a proper funeral. Volkov was taken into custody pending trial. He faced 15 years for the murder of 2 people. But he had already served the main punishment for 20 years. The torment of his conscience. In his cell, he wrote letters to the families of the deceased. He described in detail the last moments of his comrades' lives, how they defended their honor and dignity. "Igor was not afraid of death," wrote the killer. "He thought about his duty, about his oath. He said it was better to die than to disgrace his uniform." Alexei thought about his family until his last breath, Volkov wrote in another letter. "He asked me to tell his mother that he loved her. He was a good son." These letters helped the relatives better understand the character of their sons. They learned that they had died heroes, without tarnishing their military honor. The case was sent to court. Volkov had to answer for his crime, but questions remained. What drove an ordinary guy to a life of crime? How did a gaming addiction turn him into a murderer? Could Petrov and Morozov have avoided death? Why did Dmitry Volkov kill his best friends? What made him choose between debt and friendship? The truth turned out to be worse than anyone could have imagined. December 2017. The Tula Regional Court was preparing for a trial that shook the entire region. Dmitry Volkov's case made the front pages of newspapers. The double murder of fellow soldiers shocked the public. Relatives of the deceased soldiers gathered in the courtroom. Alexei Morozov's mother, Valentina Ivanovna, clutched a photograph of her son in her hands. She had waited 21 years for this day. Finally, she would find out who had taken her child from her. Elena Petrova had come from Ryazan. The younger sister of the deceased sergeant had grown into a mature woman, but the pain of her loss had not dulled. She wanted to look her brother's killer in the eyes. Volkov sat in the dock with his head bowed. He had aged even more during the year of investigation. His hair was gray, his hands were shaking, and his cheeks were sunken. Guilt was eating away at him like acid. Judge Anatoly Veselov read out the indictment. Murder of 2 persons under aggravating circumstances. Desertion. Theft of weapons. Each charge carried a serious sentence. Prosecutor Svetlana Krylova presented irrefutable evidence to the court. The defendant's confession, expert analysis of the remains and weapons, witness testimony. The picture of the crime was clear down to the smallest detail. For 21 years, the families did not know the truth, Krylova said. The mothers waited, hoped, and searched for their sons. And the murderer lived peacefully under a false name in a neighboring country. Lawyer Mikhail Dorokov tried to mitigate his client's fate. He spoke of his youth, difficult circumstances, and gambling addiction. He asked the court to take into account his sincere remorse and cooperation with the investigation. "My client has fully admitted his guilt," Dorokov asserted. "He helped find the remains of the victims and told the whole truth. This speaks of deep remorse." But the prosecutor did not accept these arguments. Volkov only cooperated after his arrest, when it became impossible to hide. Before that, he had remained silent for 20 years, knowing about the suffering of the families. The first witness to testify was investigator Markov. He gave a detailed account of the investigation. He spoke about the discovery in the hollow tree, the search for the perpetrator, and the discovery of the remains in the swamp. The expert reports confirmed all of Volkov's statements. Markov testified. Ballistic analysis proved that the shots were fired from his automatic rifle. DNA analysis identified the victims. Then hunter Sergei Kozlov entered the courtroom. The elderly man was nervous, speaking in court for the first time, but his testimony was clear and convincing. "I knew right away that something was wrong," Kozlov said. "You don't just leave a gun lying around, especially a military weapon. I decided to call the police. If it hadn't been for his discovery, the crime would have remained unsolved." Volkov continued to live in Kazakhstan, and the families never learned the truth about the fate of their sons. The testimony of former colleagues was particularly difficult to hear. Senior Sergeant Kuznetsov spoke with pain about the dead soldiers. Honest, principled young men fell victim to the greed of a comrade. Petrov dreamed of becoming an officer, Kuznetsov testified. He valued the honor of his unit more than his own life. Morozov was also a golden boy. He helped his family and sent money home. But the senior sergeant described Volkov differently. He was secretive, envious, and morally unstable. In the winter of 1996, his behavior changed dramatically for the worse. "Dmitry was constantly asking to borrow money," said the witness. "He lied about his sick parents, operations, and treatment. I believed him and gave him 5,000 rubles. He spent it all at a gambling club." Private Mikhailov talked about his trips to Udicha. He described how Volkov got his friends involved in gambling. He promised them easy money and quick riches. "I warned the guys that it was a trap," Mikhailov said. "But they didn't listen. They thought they were smarter than the system, and they ended up in debt." The judge heard all the witnesses for the prosecution. Then the floor was given to the mother of the deceased soldier. Valentina Ivanovna struggled to get up from her seat. "My Alyosha was a good boy," she began in a trembling voice. "He never hurt anyone. He helped everyone. He dreamed of coming home and marrying a girl." The old woman told of 20 years of waiting. She went to fortune tellers and search parties. She hoped that her son was alive somewhere and simply couldn't find his way home. "Now I know the truth," said Valentina Ivanovna. "My son died a hero. He did not betray his oath or dishonor his uniform. That's what matters." There was not a dry eye in the room. Even journalists hardened by court proceedings wiped away tears. The mother's pain touched the hearts of everyone present. Elena Petrova spoke of her brother as a defender of justice. From childhood, Igor could not tolerate deception and betrayal. He dreamed of serving his country honestly and with dignity. "My brother chose death over dishonor," she said. "He could have stayed alive by agreeing to the robbery, but he preferred to die with a clear conscience." It was the defendant's turn to testify. Volkov stood up, remained silent for a long time, then began to speak in a quiet voice. Absolute silence reigned in the courtroom. "I am not asking for forgiveness. I know I do not deserve it," he began. "For 20 years I have lived with this burden on my soul. Every night I saw their faces and heard their last words." Volkov recounted his torment after killing his comrades. He described how he feared every knock at the door, how he worked at the hardest jobs, punishing himself physically. "I didn't start a family. I didn't have children," the defendant continued. "I understood that I had no right to happiness. I am not worthy of human joys after what I have done." In Kazakhstan, he tried to kill himself several times, but each time he was stopped by thoughts of the families of those who had died. They had a right to know the truth. "When I was arrested, I was even glad," Volkov admitted. Finally, this torture would end. I would be able to tell what happened to the guys. The defendant recounted in detail the events of that fateful night, how he suggested to his comrades that they take part in the robbery of the warehouse, how they refused and threatened to report him to the command. "I had no choice." Volkov justified himself. "The debt collectors would have killed me anyway. I had to choose between my life and the lives of my comrades." But his excuses sounded unconvincing. There were other ways to solve the problem. He could have turned to the command, asked for protection, or transferred to another unit. "Igor offered me honest ways out," the defendant admitted. He said, "Let's go to the battalion commander and tell him everything. He'll help us with the debts and protect us from the gangsters." But Volkov was afraid of disgrace, disciplinary action, and expulsion from the army. Pride proved more important than the lives of his comrades. This was his fatal mistake. "If I could turn back time," he concluded his testimony, "I would choose any punishment instead. Let them kill me, but let the guys live." In her speech, the prosecutor demanded the maximum punishment. The crime was committed with particular cruelty. The killer had been hiding from justice for many years. Volkov took the lives of 2 young people, Krylova said. He caused unbearable pain to their families. For 20 years, he deceived the state, living under a false name. The lawyer asked for leniency. He pointed to his client's difficult life circumstances, gambling addiction, and sincere remorse. "Dmitry Volkov has already been punished," Dorokov argued. 20 years of torment is worse than any prison. He helped the investigation and contributed to establishing the truth. The court retired to deliberate. The judges had to determine a fair sentence, taking into account all the circumstances of the case and weighing the aggravating and mitigating factors. Journalists, relatives, and colleagues gathered in the courtroom corridor. Everyone was waiting for the verdict. Opinions were divided. Some demanded the maximum sentence, others asked for mercy. 3 hours later, the judges returned to the courtroom. Judge Veselov read out the verdict. Dmitry Volkov was found guilty on all counts. The court sentenced him to 14 years in a strict regime colony. The sentence took into account mitigating circumstances, remorse, cooperation with the investigation, and difficult living conditions. Volkov listened to the verdict standing, without emotion. 14 years in prison seemed to him a fair punishment for the lives he had taken. Perhaps behind bars, he would find long-awaited peace. After the verdict was announced, Alexei Morozov's mother approached Volkov. Valentina Ivanovna looked long and hard into the eyes of her son's killer. "I cannot forgive you," she said quietly, "but I see that you have punished yourself more severely than any court could. Perhaps God will forgive you." These words shook everyone present. Even in her grief, the old woman found the strength to show humanity. She set an example of Christian mercy. Volkov was led away in handcuffs. A long journey to a prison colony in Mordovia awaited him. But for the first time in 20 years, the weight on his soul began to lift. The families of the victims received what they had been waiting for 2 decades. Not money. Volkov was poor. But most importantly, they received the truth about the death of their sons and a just punishment for the murderer. The remains of Petrov and Morozov were solemnly reburied in a military cemetery in Tula. Hundreds of people attended the ceremony. Soldiers, veterans, relatives, and ordinary townspeople. Black granite monuments were erected on the graves. Sergeant Igor Petrov, 1974-1996, died defending military honor. Private Alexei Morozov, 1976-1996, faithful to his duty until his last breath. Valentina Ivanovna often visited the cemetery. She brought flowers, cleaned the grave, and talked to her son. 20 years of uncertainty were over, but the pain of loss remained. Elena Petrova brought her children to her brother's grave. She told them about their uncle Igor, whom they would never see. She told them how important it was to be honest and principled. In the colony, Volkov became a model prisoner. He worked in a sewing workshop, helped the administration, and did not break the rules. He received several commendations for good behavior. He wrote detailed letters to the families of those who had died. He told them about the last moments of his comrades' lives, about how they thought about home, their parents, and the future. Igor talked about his plans after the army, Volkov wrote. He wanted to go to military school and become an officer. He dreamed of serving his country honestly and with dignity. Alexei recalled his childhood, his mother, his native village. The killer wrote in another letter. He showed a photo of the girl he wanted to marry. He loved life. These letters helped the relatives better understand their sons. They learned about their dreams, plans, and last thoughts. For the grieving families, this was more valuable than money. The story took an unexpected turn. In the colony, Volkov met an inmate who knew Viktor Semenov, the same debt collector with gold teeth. "The golden one was killed in 2005, said his cellmate. His competitors ordered it. But before he died, he talked a lot. He bragged about his deeds. Semenov talked about how he intimidated a young soldier. He demanded an impossible sum and threatened him with violence. He knew that the guy would do anything to save himself. He planned to use Volkov to rob a warehouse, his cellmate revealed, and then kill him as a witness. It would have been the perfect operation. Volkov realized that the debt collectors had no intention of letting him go. Even if the robbery had been successful, they would have killed him anyway. He had become a pawn in someone else's game. This news did not justify the murder of his comrades, but it explained the hopelessness of the situation in which the young soldier found himself. He was doomed from the start. In 2021, Volkov was released on parole. He served 10 years of his 14-year sentence. His sentence was reduced for good behavior. He was 45 years old, his health ruined by prison. His hair had turned completely gray, and his back was bent from hard labor. But for the first time in a quarter of a century, he felt free from his past. After his release, Volkov went to Tula. His first stop was the cemetery, where he visited the graves of his comrades. He stood there for a long time with flowers, asking for forgiveness and promising to live a decent life. Finding a job proved difficult. His criminal record for murder scared off employers. But the cemetery administration agreed to hire him as a guard. It was ironic that he was now guarding the peace of those he had sent to their final resting place. Every day, he saw the graves of Petrov and Morozov and remembered their time together in the army. In the evenings, Volkov would visit his comrades' graves. He would tell them about his life, his plans, and his hopes for the future. It was as if they were still there, still his friends. Alexei Morozov's mother sometimes met him at the cemetery. They didn't talk, just nodded silently to each other. Their shared grief united them in a strange bond. Valentina Ivanovna died in 2023 at the age of 80. Until her last days, she visited her son and brought him flowers. Volkov attended her funeral. Elena Petrova still could not forgive her brother's killer. When they met, she turned away and avoided conversation. She understood his remorse, but she couldn't forgive him. Volkov understood this and didn't insist. He knew that some crimes are unforgivable. It was enough that the families knew the truth and had buried their sons with dignity. In 2024, it was 28 years since the tragedy. Relatives, colleagues, and acquaintances of the fallen soldiers gathered at the cemetery. Volkov stood at a distance, not daring to approach the crowd. He understood that his presence could upset people, but he couldn't leave either. An elderly man in military uniform approached him. It was Colonel Gromov, the former commander of the unit. Volkov recognized him despite the years. "Dmitri?" the officer asked. Volkov nodded, expecting anger and condemnation. But the colonel held out his hand. There was no malice in his eyes, only fatigue. "I remember the young man you were," said Gromov. "A capable, hard-working soldier. What happened to you?" Volkov didn't know what to say. How could he explain that one mistake could ruin a whole life? That weakness of character could turn a person into a murderer? "Forgive me, Comrade Colonel," he whispered. "I forgave you long ago," replied the officer. "But you must forgive yourself. Otherwise, you will carry this burden for the rest of your life." After that conversation, something changed in Volkov's soul. He began seeing a psychologist and trying to build relationships with people. For the first time in decades, he believed in the possibility of a new life. But the memory of his fallen comrades will remain with him forever. Every morning, he visits their graves, brings flowers, and cleans the area. This is his voluntary penance. The story of the three soldiers has become a warning to young people. Military academies now tell stories about how gambling led soldiers to crime. The gambling business continues to flourish, changing only its form. Instead of underground clubs, there are online casinos and bookmakers. But the essence remains the same. People lose their last money. Volkov sometimes speaks to military personnel about his story. He warns them against gambling and tells them about the consequences of gambling addiction. "I thought I was in control," he tells young soldiers. "It seemed like I could always stop, but the addiction was stronger than my mind." His story makes a strong impression on his audience. Young people see where easy money and get-rich-quick schemes lead. In 2025, the military warehouse that Volkov wanted to rob was finally dismantled. A memorial complex to military glory was built in its place. Among the names of the fallen heroes are those of Igor Petrov and Alexei Morozov. They will forever remain in memory as examples of military honor and comradely loyalty. Volkov often visits the memorial. He reads the names of his comrades on the marble slabs, recalls their service together, and dreams of what might have been. What would have happened if he hadn't gone to that ill-fated gambling club? Perhaps all three would have served honorably, returned home, and started families. Petrov could have become a general, Morozov a successful engineer, and Volkov himself could have been a model family man and father. But fate decided otherwise. One wrong decision changed the course of many lives. It deprived parents of their sons, friends of their comrades, and the country of its honest defenders. The story is over, but its lessons live on. It shows how fragile the line between good and evil is, how easy it is to fall into the abyss with one wrong step. But most importantly, it speaks of the power of remorse and the possibility of forgiveness. Even the most terrible sin can be atoned for with an honest life and sincere repentance. Truth always wins, even if not immediately. Justice prevails, even if it comes 20 years late. And the memory of the fallen heroes lives on in people's hearts. Igor Petrov and Alexei Morozov will forever remain young defenders of honor and dignity. What do you think? Is it possible to forgive someone who sincerely repents of their crime? Is suffering enough to atone for such a grave sin?